So let's take a look at the edit. I guess I've given people a couple of minutes to get in the chat room. If anybody turns up late, we'll catch them up as we go. But we are going to be editing an engagement session today. We're going to be editing an engagement I did a couple of weeks back. Normally when I'm photographing, I offer different packages depending on how much coverage you want. And for this session, they opted for a whole day engagement shoot. So we have multiple different locations. There was Manchester city centre, looking a bit more of an urban setting. There was the inn at Whitewell, which is in the middle of the Lancashire countryside. And then we had like an area in the Lake District in Cumbria. So there's going to be a few different areas we're going to be looking at for the edit. So let's take a look at Lightroom and we'll go for there. So this is Lightroom. If you're not familiar with it, it is a program that lets you edit RAW files. These are all exactly as they came out of camera, and I shoot with a Sony A7R, sorry, an A7 II. These were with the 35mm 1.4 and the 55mm 1.8. They are my two lenses that I use most of the time. I use other wedding cameras and lenses, but these are the main two that I'll use pretty much for every shoot. Favorite focal lengths, really like them. So we're going to start with my typical workflow. Now, library module is useful for syncing lots of settings. So you can have multiple images, you edit one, you can synchronize settings between them. It's good for culling and choosing the photographs you want to edit. In this case, I've already culled, mainly because I wanted to make sure that we were looking at pictures that were flattering for the people that were in them, and we weren't going to be looking at pictures that were unflattering to the models of the subjects, in this case, the couple. Grant and Holly are great, really great people, lovely people, and it does help that they're both absolutely stunning. So we're going to start by looking in the develop module. Now, when I'm editing, I like to make sure that I have kind of a good starting point. And although you can go through and individually change different sliders to adjust things like exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, whites, clarity, and make an edit by just going through and tweaking things at random or at a formula that you've got, I use presets. The majority of people that follow me know that I used to shoot film exclusively and then moved to digital over time. So the presets that I used are based around film. They're made by a company called Maston Labs, and I'll put a link to that somewhere shortly. But typically, I'll start with a base preset, usually either Portra 400 or Fuji 400H. Now, for an urban setting, I tend to prefer Kodak films, mainly because I feel like it gives a bit more of an even base. The skin tones are a little bit more warm and rich. You tend to get quite a lot of cold light in shaded areas, and the city tends to be shaded. So we're going to have a look at editing this image. So I feel like it's a little bit too dark. We're going to raise the exposure. And even though the preset's done a lot to kind of warm up the skin tones, I feel like they could do with being a little bit warmer. You can kind of see how that kind of opens things up. You don't want to go too warm because it kind of messes with the colors in the background and you lose that nice vibrant blue. You want it to be a good contrast between the skin tones in the foreground and the kind of nice blue that you've got in the graffiti in the background. Now, another point of preference is to choose whether or not to enable lens profile corrections. Now, typically when you're doing this, you're in a situation where you might not have the kind of ideal lens. And if you can see, it kind of removes the vignetting from the background. It kind of takes away some of the chromatic aberration if there is any. But I tend to prefer it off, mainly because I feel like a large part of the character of the lens is in that vignette. It's in the way that it kind of distorts the frame, and turning lens corrections off, or turning lens corrections on rather, gets rid of that kind of character from the lens. It's really interesting to see how much difference it makes. If we move to the next image, we'll really see just how big of a difference those small edits made to this image. So you've got this like nice contrast, great skin tones, a bit warmer, and this by contrast looks pretty dull. So typically I'll hit previous, and that copies all of my basic adjustments from the last image. So when I'm going through and editing, you can be relatively quick in that you can skip from image to image and you can see the edits as you go. Now, if we scroll up, I think this could do with being a little bit brighter, because even though the settings in camera didn't change, I feel like we needed a little bit more separation from the background. I'm just trying to find the perfect sort of balance here. Getting the exposure just right. I also feel like there's a little bit less contrast in this image. Like if you look at the two, the darks here look really quite black, which is nice. I like that because it kind of makes them stand out against the background. And in this, even though the contrast there is probably around about the same, it feels like because you're a bit further back, there's more light in the image, it needs a bit more contrast. So in the Master Labs presets, they build in some kind of settings that were meant to be on the scanners that they use for film. So all hard meant that it added the maximum amount of black and the maximum amount of white, which means that you've got more contrast in your image. So I'm going to try that. And that's kind of helped a little bit. So you can see that kind of black points come back down here on this kind of side of the jacket. Now you can do the opposite, all soft, and as you can see, that raised everything in the image. The whole thing gets lower contrast. You're not seeing as much kind of contrast in the blacks or in the whites. And to be honest, it looks a bit kind of dull. So we're going to undo that. We're going to go back to the all hard because it's what I prefer. And then we're going to move to the next image, and it's pretty much the same. So if we apply previous, we get pretty much the same kind of look. Again, nice moment between the two of them. And this is kind of how I edit. So now that I've got that base preset, you can see how quickly this editing process goes until you get to an image like this, where it's kind of like I must have changed the setting in the camera. And I think if we look at it, so you can see under my face, there's some settings here. This was shot at 250 to the second. And here it was shot at the same settings, so the light must have changed. But what I want to see is a bit more brightness in his skin. We're going to boost skin tones and the whole exposure a little bit. And we're left with this, which to me is a much more pleasing picture. And actually, it keeps the consistency between the shots. You can see that here, in this image, his skin's nice and bright, their skin's nice and bright, there's a good amount of black and contrast. And now we have the same in this image. Whereas if we look at the before shot, kind of didn't have that. And again, previous, to apply the same settings. Now, this is an example of a situation where I would use a different tool. So in this image, everything looks quite kind of balanced. But when I applied the preset, I noticed that this area on the right got a lot brighter. And that's not really what I want. So we use the gradient tool, and we are going to put a minus exposure adjustment, which is just going to make this edge area a little bit darker. Now, we can go overboard to see exactly what's being affected, but then we gradually want to bring things back. You can see it's just adding balance into the frame. You're not looking to kind of overpower everything. And the really distracting part was those whites and those highlights. So actually, we might not even need an exposure adjustment at all. And if we check with that off and on, it's just doing a little bit to bring your attention into the center of the frame. It doesn't have to be a huge adjustment, just a little bit to bring your attention back in. And again, because the placement of the frame is really similar, if we hit previous, you can see it just makes it darker again on that edge. And again, copy and paste the edits. We go from that kind of blank canvas, quite flat image, something much brighter. Now here again, we've had a change in the light or the exposure, so I need to bring this back down. And again, the aim is to match so that these two frames don't look significantly different. Again, over time you can see that there's a little bit of trial and error involved in making sure that they're the same. There you go. Now, one issue with using local adjustments like that gradient that we put in is that when you get to an image that's not in the same lighting situation, it can be a bit of a challenge because you need to remember to get rid of it manually. Otherwise, you'll end up in a situation where you've got random bits of dark in your image and you don't really want that. Again, let's boost the exposure up to get that brightness back. Again, trying to keep the skin tones the same. But whenever I'm editing, the number one thing I'm looking at is the skin in the image. And just making sure that that general color is nice, the skin tone's warm, but you keep a good balance of colors in the image as well. I mean, feel free to ask questions if anybody's got anything they want to say or anything they want to know more about in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm just going to go through and keep editing this way. Now here again, this is a situation where I might think about changing how I'm editing. So I'm not convinced this is the best look for this image. So if you see this, that color really makes it work. It adds a lot to the image. Whereas here, I feel like when we apply the same settings, we don't get that same kind of impact, and there isn't that punch that we're looking for. And we have two options. Either we can have a look at using a higher contrast preset, or adding contrast in the settings, or using the tone curve, or we can use black and white. And I'm going to try a black and white, and I'll show you why. So this again is a Maston Labs preset. This is Delta 3200 medium format. And you can see that it makes the shadows completely disappear. And when you're looking at the main image, all the attention's on his face. Now, when you're shooting, you need to expose for this. So you need to be thinking about where your light source is coming from. Because if this was evenly lit, you would not get this effect. And there's no amount of editing that would get you that. So this is pretty much what I saw when I was shooting the image. You can see that it's made all the adjustments to the photograph. I don't think this needs much more. I would probably leave it like that and deliver. And again, same lighting situation. We can use the same edit. And again, we get a great look to our image. Maybe a tad bright. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with it. Now, if we do the same, because this is actually a different angle, but the same lighting situation, you can see how this black and white takes all of the unevenness out of the skin. I mean, Holly's got pretty great skin to begin with. It's not as if she had bad skin. But that preset takes all of the kind of imperfections in the skin out of the image. Okay. Now, this is a bit of a challenging situation. Now, I would never really recommend you shoot in a car garage. It seems like a bad idea, because if you look at it, the light seems kind of like green and yellow. So before I apply the preset, I would adjust the white balance. We drop it down in terms of the warmth and increase tint. That gives us like a reasonably good base, and you can see the skin's already looking to start a lot better. The walls don't look as green, the roof doesn't look as green, it looks like colours that it should. And from this point, we go back to applying our preset. Like I said, for me, I always start with Portrait 400 because it's my preferred palette. Now, when we applied that, it adds a lot more greens back into the image. So you'd need to remove them by adding purple. So if you're seeing green, adding purple will remove the green tint you're seeing. Add that magenta tint. And then we come down, and I'm actually going to enable lens corrections here, because if you see in the background there's these fringes on the lights. That's called chromatic aberration. And when you see chromatic aberration, it's a problem with your lens. Usually it's either because the lens isn't very good or because you're shooting in a challenging situation. This was a challenging situation. So if you enable profile corrections and go to manual and get this ink dropper tool, and you can find the fringe, click it, and then you can remove some of the green fringing. Now, part of the issue is that there isn't really a way to completely remove it. And making changes here can actually end up in situations where there's a local adjustment that needs to be made. And I don't think we can get rid of that. So we are just going to have to live with it, I think. Which doesn't really bother me. I'd rather get a good moment in a nice place with good leading lines where you can see some imperfections than miss the moment. That's cool. And yeah, so if you hit previous, you can kind of see how this changes. And again, you can see that color fringing. So you see the purple and the green. That's around the lips. So again, in this situation, you might either try and get rid of the purple by again hitting the eyedropper and finding that purple tone. And then again, you can see that it automatically tries to remove that color. And you can get rid of more by pulling this over. And you can see that it's not gotten rid of the issue, but it's minimized it a lot. So you end up in a situation where you don't see anywhere near that amount of fringe. Yeah, and that definitely helps. Again, because we're copying and pasting settings between images, when I move on and I hit previous, this is going to remove, again, all the fringing in the background. You're going to get the same color balance. That lens correction is going to take some of the vignette out. And in this area, there's enough darkness already, so it looks good. And that kind of helps to get through this. So we're going to keep going until we get to the end of this section, and then I am going to take a second to look at the chat. So if any of you guys have got questions, now is probably a good time to ask them, because I'll be able to read them in just a second. That is super cute. Such a nice moment. Hey, so let's take a look at the chat. So yeah, the color fringing is really bad, Francisco. Like I agree, it's insane how much it can distract you from an image, and it's the more you edit, the more you see it, which is a pain. But again, I'd much rather have some of it in there and have a great moment like that than not have it all. Does anybody have any questions? I'm glad I could help, Milton. Yeah, previous is like literally the reason why I can't switch to Capture One. So Milton said that he didn't know that the previous button copied the settings from the last image. That's exactly what it does. And I've tried other editing programs, like I've tried seriously to use Capture One, which is made by Phase One, and Sony endorses it. It does a slightly better job at kind of like converting the Sony RAW files, but it doesn't have a lot of the features that Lightroom has, and if it does, they're not as easy to use. So yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, I'm going to carry on editing. I'm going to keep looking at the stuff rather than talking about boring stuff. If anybody has any questions, keep posting them in chat, and I'll periodically come back to them and answer any questions. So this is kind of where I start getting the black and white again, because I feel like the color doesn't really add anything to this. And even if I color corrected for part of it, the shadow under the umbrella is going to change the color. I just think it'd probably be bad. Also, I feel like the way they're dressed is really classic. So if I can, I'm going to use black and white. Now, if you hit J on the keyboard, it'll show you where there's no information in the color or the black and white. And you can see there's so much area in this image where you can't see any information. So again, remember I said before that all hard adds contrast and all soft takes it away? Well, it actually allows you to vary individually. So if you use highlight hard, it makes the bright areas brighter. And if you use shadow hard, that makes the dark areas darker. Highlight soft, bright areas darker. Shadow soft, dark areas lighter. So if we click shadow soft, you see how that's taken back some of that black area, so that now when we see the image, we've got information and detail in his hair and in the umbrella. We're going to leave it at that because I think that adds a good amount of contrast. There's good skin tones. It's a nice moment. We'll move on. And again, same lighting situation. Nothing else has changed. Hit previous. Again, move on. And then you get that. And again, cheating through in between moments, get the shot you wanted. Now this is a different situation. Now on the day, it was absolutely bucketing it down. There was so much rain. So we took shelter under a bridge. And this is actually still right next to that car park. But I really liked the archways in the background and the blue color that was coming from the sky being so overcast. So we stopped here for a while. And this is where the black and white's going to go away for a bit because I really, really like the color here. And again, we're going to start with a base preset. We can either start with Portrait 400, which gives us a nice even base, or we can do a pushed portrait, which is the same thing but with way more contrast. And you can see that when it's this dark, it doesn't look particularly flattering, but if you raise the exposure, again, it adds a really dynamic image. Now, I think I still prefer the lower contrast version. I'll probably stick with this and a little bit of a darker exposure. But again, a really cool moment. Really like that. But yeah, it's really cool. Welcome to the chat, Ines. Yeah, you're not late. I'm going to be doing this for a while. This shoot has got a lot of images in it, so feel free to ask any questions that you want to ask any. But yeah, we're going to keep going through. So again, base preset applied. I feel like the contrast is good here. I might try it with a little bit more. So like all hard, again, adding contrast in the shadows and the highlights. And again, I like the way that it looks. Now, normally, if I was doing an edit for a client delivery, I would take a moment to clone out some of the imperfections in the skin, because Grant doesn't actually look like this. It's just that I was using a really sharp lens and it's not really flattering. but the lens itself is rendering is incredible, so I wanted to keep that. I'd probably go through and give them a bit of a help take away some of the imperfections in the skin. It's time consuming, it's absolutely worth it. I don't do anything that removes a feature in somebody's face. If you've got a birthmark, it's staying. I don't change the shape of anybody because I feel like it's not fair, it's not real. But doing something like taking away a spot if you've had a bad skin day, I'll definitely do that. Again, previous to apply the changes from the previous shot. Now, looking at these, I actually think these are still a little bit cold. So I'm going to warm them up just a little bit with the temperature slider. And actually, I think I'm just going to default to daylight. Now, if you've not seen these before, these are what Lightroom thinks a certain color temperature should look like. And if you're ever trying to add consistency to your color edit, this is a really good way of making sure that you're editing correctly. Because if you were in daylight and you hit daylight and things look off, you might think that you need to adjust another setting. For example, if your preset adjusts the color balance, you might have a problem there. So if you ever get a situation where you're in the correct setting here, as in daylight, and yet for some reason the actual image does not look correct, either you have a problem with your white balance or you weren't actually in the lighting situation you thought you were. So this is a really good way of making sure that you've got good color presets that aren't like overly affecting the image. So anything that you produce for preset should change things, and you should be able to adjust the white balance and the exposure and still maintain a good image. Again, just applying the previous from there, and you can see how that little change kind of takes it from being very blue to being a bit more natural, and the skin warms up a little bit. Now here it's a little bit darker. Again, I'd raise the exposure. Look at her eyes in that shot. Super cool. Now, in the camera, I'd noticed that there was something wrong with the exposure. So can you see I've added quite a lot of additional exposure in the shot. Now, Sony cameras are great because they let you push the image quite a long way, which is great because it means that if you underexpose an image to, say, retain detail and highlights, it's still there. But they also have an electronic viewfinder, so it's quite easy to see when you've got the exposure wrong. But even though these shots were only like fractions of a second apart, I'd realized after taking 2 shots that I was probably a little bit too dark. So I've corrected the exposure. So here, even though the image looks pretty much the same, I'm using way less exposure adjustment, which makes things a little bit more consistent. Again, now that I've changed the exposure, keep those common. Maybe a slight variation there. Keep the skin tones the same. Again, the way I'm judging exposure is looking at how the skin is. If I'm seeing a different luminance in the skin, I'm changing the exposure. To be honest, everything else in the image is secondary. If the skin looks good, it's probably a good image. Yeah. Now again, you can see that there's like an apparent change in this. So here, I feel like the vignette from the lens isn't adding something. I feel like it's taking away from the image. So we mentioned earlier about lens corrections and how I usually keep it off. This is another situation where I would probably turn that back on if I can find out where they are. There we go. Again, enable profile corrections, and you can just see that let's raise the shadows at the top of the image and at the bottom image, and you end up with a much more even feel to it. So your eyes aren't drawn to the center of the frame quite as much, but I feel like in an image like this, it's not quite as important. It's pretty clear where you should be looking. She's in focus, nothing else is. It's a lot more straightforward. We're going to move to the next shot, and again, apply the same thing. And it's strange because here I really feel like we need that vignette to bring the attention in, because it's a little bit further back. You can keep it off, you can turn it on. I'm going to leave it off. And again, a little bit darker in this situation. Again, brighten that up. Now, we've already got a couple of shots that look like this in this pose, in this area. So this is, again, where I'd start looking for alternative looks. I do this on purpose because sometimes I feel like expressions look different. So again, I'll shoot through a moment, as in photographing beyond what I think I would need. And also, I feel like having a black and white image, especially here when we're focusing on his expression, is important because it makes me feel like he's like in anticipation of marrying this girl. I feel like it's kind of taking the color away, takes some of the distraction out of the image. And again, we already have the first shot, we already have it in color, and now we have it in black and white for a second feeling. Now, here, in this kind of slightly wider shot, I'm kind of thinking that the color might be better. So you see we come through a few black and white images. Now if I hit previous, black and white. Quick trick, if you put your mouse at the bottom of the frame, it brings up the film strip. You can go back to your last color image and then click back into the image you were just editing and then hit previous, and it applies the color adjustments from the last image you had selected. So it's not the one before it in the film strip, just in case you're wondering that. It's whatever you had selected last. Then again, we can boost that exposure back up. Now, normally I spend longer cropping images, but for the sake of this edit, I was kind of not doing that. But this is bugging me too much. I absolutely hate it when horizons are not level. So especially in an image where there's a lot of these repeating lines and you can see these verticals should be lined up, I spend time to make sure they line up. I feel like it's really worth having that extra time spent making sure that section of the image is correct. And again, much more of an epic shot. You can really see how badly it was raining. I mean, look at that, that's crazy. And again, these guys were amazing for kind of coming out in this terrible weather and braving the shoot. But again, I feel like color is important to this. And actually, I feel kind of like we need to see more of that rain. And if you look at, it's all on the edges of the frame. I'm going to have a look and see what it looks like if we take the lens corrections off. And I feel like it probably makes the edges too bright now. We can just leave that off. And again, when I'm editing, always for skin tones. So I want a bit more detail in the skin. I'll bring that up. I also feel like the image, especially around the edges, is kind of lacking contrast. You've got two options. You can either make a global adjustment by, again, applying all hard and adding contrast in both areas. Or you can do what we did earlier and drag in a gradient to correct the image. And again, now we know where it's affecting. We can do things like bring back the highlights and the whites. And then you can add contrast. And again, you can do that on both sides of the image. And can you see it's retained the same changes? You can pull this in, you get just the areas you want affected. To say, in this image, I feel like they are already contrasty, but you can already see them well, they already stand out. But these edges look a little bit low contrast. So I'm just lining these adjustment layers up with these pillars, but we know that they are affecting things in the right angle. There we go. That's kind of what we're left with. So that's the other option you've got. Has there been any questions about anything so far? Because I feel like we've covered quite a lot. And there's a bit of a lag on the chat, so feel free to take your time. In the meantime, I'm just going to keep editing images, but feel free to ask questions if you have any. Yeah, it's a huge difference, Christina. The lens corrections like really change things, and so does the white balance. It's a really interesting way to kind of use the tool. It's really good. Cool. Gotta keep going. If I'm talking too much, like, feel free to tell me. Like, I genuinely have never done this before, so this is my first attempt at live streaming. I feel like constructive criticism would go down well. So again, like, we're in the same lighting situation here. So again, I'm going to copy the previous settings, and you can see that largely that does a really good job. And normally I would take out these gradients that we put in before, but actually by accident, they perfectly line up. Now, of the two, I probably prefer this shot because there's a cyclist. The only problem is that the expression in this shot is kind of too good not to include. Again, I would always keep that in. And again, that might be the image on the blog post, but that's my favorite. I definitely prefer this. And this goes back to the, right, yeah, just paying attention to the chat. Sorry if I seem distracted. yeah, it's really cool. I was just catching up in the chat to find out what you guys are saying, but yeah, it's definitely straightening. It is important. It really bugs me when lines aren't straight. But again, sometimes it's about the moment, and you're focusing on other things. So you do everything you can in camera to make sure the image is straight, like keeping your hands level, all that kind of stuff. But really, it's important to make sure that you're kind of maintaining the expression over any other technical aspect. The image doesn't count for anything if the subject's boring, so it's worth shooting it one way and then correcting it afterwards. Now, I was saying about this shot that this is the better moment. I tend not to Photoshop things because it is possible and probably not that difficult to take this guy out of the shot. I personally don't like doing that because I feel like it does something about the moment, and I feel like if I did that on this shot, I'd be tempted to do that on every photograph. And there's something honest about keeping in things that were there on the day. But even if they weren't ideal, at least this way you know my image is honest and I've not added this biker or just taken something out of the background. It was there, so it'll be there. And there is an exception to that, and I'll come on to that later on. But again, shooting through, same lighting situation. Now, you'll see me do this quite a bit. Now, this is another issue, because I've straightened the last image, you can see that it's applied the same straightening. You just go back in and reset and it takes it away. In camera, very often, I will shoot so that it isn't meant to be displayed in this aspect. So when you normally take a picture on a 35mm camera, it's 3 tall or 3 wide and 2 the other direction. I like to crop it to 4x5, which is how Instagram displays portrait images. And if you look in this shot, you can tell that I've shot with that in mind because this top area, there's nothing there. There's no information. Yeah. And the next shot, again, very similar. So you can tell, again, I've shot with the same composition in mind. Taking that top level out makes no difference to the composition. Now, one thing I'd missed is this green fringing at the top. And because it's been a while since we've had an image with this problem, the adjustments that we had on previously are now gone again. So in this case, I want to keep the vignette, but I want the lens corrections on. If you click Enable Profile Corrections, and you turn the distortion all the way to the left, and the vignette all the way to the left, it actually turns off the majority of the corrections to the lens. You can go into Manual, zoom in, and then you can get rid of this color fringing, and it doesn't affect any of the characteristic qualities of the lens. Now, the issue here is getting the right green, and you can see all of a sudden that's instantly improved. Again, hit done, move out, got a much better image. Now again, I'd applied a crop. It's usually the last thing I'll do. But because I know that I'm going to be going through and making these previous edits and moving between portrait shots and horizontal shots, I'm usually not going to apply the same crop to everything. So if I'm being practical, cropping should come last. It was to illustrate a point. So in this case, I'm going to reset the crop again, and you can see they're nicely on the third. Now, this is probably a good point to talk about thirds in composition. And again, you can see that those extra gradients are now starting to interfere with the image. So I'll take those away. From now on, there won't be in any of the shots that we kind of post. But if you look at the image here and we open the crop tool, there's a handy little function that shows you where somebody's head is. And for a good photograph, to have the content in the right place, like technically the correct place to put somebody, you should put them on a third. So we're talking about on this area here, and then you either have content here and here. So basically trying to keep them in this little box in the middle. But if I was to try and optimize this, I might move this in a little bit and switch the crop up. It's a little bit closer. Now again, like I said before, I would rather the image was natural. But all I'm going to do here is correct for the horizon, because you can see this little line in the background, and then leave it at that. I might actually crop it a little bit higher because it's chopping off a bit of the space above his head. And again, go back to the image, and we will raise the exposure again to get the skin tones right. Now, this is a situation where just boosting the exposure isn't going to fix it. So again, I'm trying to add contrast back into the shot. And even then, it doesn't quite look right to my eyes. The areas around her face here are a little bit too bright. Again, I think this is a candidate for a black and white image. So we turn on the black and white processes, and it still feels low contrast. We add all hard, and that adds more contrast in. Now, one oddity of the Mastin Labs presets is that it takes away some of the apparent brightness in the image. So you need to kind of raise the exposure quite a lot. So in a lot of my shots, even though the original image actually looks pretty well exposed, maybe slightly under, when I actually go to edit, I end up moving the exposure quite a way up. And again, that isn't because the initial shot was completely wrong, although sometimes I do underexpose to retain detail. It's because the preset changes the balance of tones in the image, and it means that you end up in a situation where it is darker than it would be otherwise. So again, I've just turned the lens profile corrections on and removed the vignette because I feel like some of the lack of brightness is coming from the lens vignette. And I think that's pretty cool. So we're going to move on from there. And again, previous, because again, the emotion is the important thing. Now again, this lighting's changed a little bit more. We could either go to black and white again, which would look kind of like that. I'm just going to reset the crop adjustment, which in truth I really like. This is a really interesting look. Like her eyes like really, really, really stand out in this image the way it is right now. But again, I feel like there's quite a lot of color here that would add something to the image. So I'm going to go down to Portrait 400 again, reapply that. Now you'll notice that there's too much grain in this image because the black and white film presets add grain. So I'm going to get rid of the grain that would normally be in this image by going down to the detail section. I believe is where grain is kept, or is it effects? It is effects. There we go. I'm going to turn the grain off because there's too much grain. And again, we're left with an image that's quite low contrast. And this isn't necessarily going to be as easy to fix as the last image was. So we're going to go through and try a few of these. And I actually think the brightness is now a little bit high. Look at it. And again, you can see that here. So again, her eyes look great. Not quite as good as black and white, but still pretty good. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's an even higher contrast version of these presets, which is the pushed film look. And if you look at that, that kind of adds that kind of pop to her eyes that the black and white had. I can even go back to the same exposure I had for the black and white image, and I've suddenly got this really nice contrasty image with that really nice detail in her eyes. I feel like this is a little bit high contrast, but it's a better base than the last image. So I'm going to add a bit more exposure, but turn on all soft so it takes some of the contrast out. So you end up with an overall brighter image that still has slightly lower contrast than the base preset. Just kind of look at the chat for a minute to see what we're up to. So somebody in the chat was asking about color presets and who would recommend apart from Mastin Labs. I have tried a lot of different presets. I used Visco for years when it came out and didn't like how heavy-handed it was. I felt like there was too much contrast. They changed the colors a lot, and there used to be like a kind of weird yellowy or green tint in the skin tones and the shadows. I feel like the Mastin Labs presets are the nearest thing I've ever seen to film, and that is actually quite important because for me, the colors that I got from shooting Portrait 400 were the reason why I continue with photography. I really, really liked it. So I don't have any desire to change, but I am trying something a bit different. So there is a company called Lutify that makes LUTs for film. And if you look at what just happened there when I turned on soft proofing, it adds that kind of like cinematic kind of orange skin, blue background look that you get in cinema. And the way that it does this is it changes the camera calibration. So you can see at the top here it says sRGB, which is just regular colors. It adds like changes to the way that Lightroom reads color. And it can do that on a level that you can't really do with a standard preset. And if you look down here, where Mastin Labs was making huge changes to all these sections to try and get a perfect image, you can see that this isn't even touched. All of these different panels here are completely standard. So if I want to change this, we come out of soft proofing, and it looks exactly like the standard image. To say if I wanted that to be brighter, I can brighten the image. And then if I return to soft proofing, it applies all the same color presets afterwards. So I feel like there's a lot of stuff that could happen with LUTS. And I think if you're going to invest in a preset system from another company, you should stick with one set, because there's so much difference between one preset and another. And if you're going to maintain a consistent look, you should keep with them. If you can create your own color presets that you like, then feel free to do that. I personally feel like I couldn't do it better than Mastin does. There's a company there that's spending literally all of their time producing presets to look good. Whereas for me, I'm shooting, I'm trying to market, I've got other things to do other than work on my own color preset. And I feel like my work is good enough that that will set me apart. I don't necessarily have to rely on the colors in my images to do that. So I kind of hope that answers your question. But so it's kind of a two thing. So I'm going to stick with Mastin Labs for the time being. I am keeping an eye on LUTS because I feel like there's a lot more flexibility in that. And I think that as we move into a situation where we have to incorporate more video into our kind of professional photography, I think we're going to be in a situation where we need to get used to using LUTs, using programs like Lightroom to color correct, and then applying a LUT on top of that to make it match the video footage that we produce. So that was a very long and boring answer to what was a really simple question. So I'm sorry about that, but kind of like what's been on my mind recently. And again, like just going back to the edit. But on second look, this like really looks too high contrast. So I'm going to go back to the Portra 400, and again, this is me going back to what I was saying a minute ago. Yeah, it's going back to what I was saying a minute ago about having that kind of consistent look. Like whenever I see anything other than the normal presets that I use on my work, it looks wrong, and it's probably just what I'm used to. But I don't know. It kind of makes you pay attention to what you like. And the other thing is, because I'm so used to seeing the same look in my images, it's quite jarring when I kind of see something different. I just skipped ahead there. So again, in this situation, this is probably an image I would make black and white. So I mentioned before about moments over like technical perfection. There's motion blur in this image. You can see in a face it's not 100% as sharp as it could be. And there's also like a bit of missed focus. But this lens is probably focused on the front of her hair here, which is actually slightly behind her face, because obviously she was moving forward to kiss him, and I've missed the shot. However, I feel like if you're going to use a black and white preset, that sharpness loss is not as noticeable. So again, I'd usually use black and white as a way of making an image that's slightly motion blurred or slightly out of focus look more like it's in context. Because if you were shooting film, you would normally be shooting a film like Delta 3200 when there was limited light and you were having to shoot wide open. So like part of us is aware that if you're seeing this grainy black and white look, it's not going to be in focus. It's not going to be perfectly sharp. And actually, some of the images that don't look as good in black and white because we are kind of expecting a bit of that motion blur. So again, that's why I would select this kind of preset for this kind of shot. Great moment. Maybe it's not a great moment. I guess that's up to you, but I really like it. And I feel like taking the color away puts the feeling back into the image. Same story. So again, really, really nice moment. Not quite as sharp as it could have been. All of a sudden it looks a lot more romantic, and like that motion blur that's in this shot belongs there. This is a change of situation. Now, this is one of the worst parts of living in England. Literally this entire day, there was torrential rain. It was really bad. And again, they're having a great time. It was a fantastic shoot. We really loved doing this. But the light is a bit kind of bland. And you end up in situations where you kind of have to add some of the interest back in. And again, we'll be using the gradient tool. I'm just going to bring this in from the edges. And again, this is with I'm going to exaggerate the effect so I can see a little bit more clearly. There are other ways to do this. I prefer this way because I can see an exposure change as opposed to a color going over the top. If you click this little button here, you can set a color overlay instead, but we're not going to do that. We're going to do this instead. And again, what I'm trying to do is remove some of the attention, and your eyes are usually drawn to highlights. So again, I'm going to try and remove some of the highlights that are away from the couple because I want your eye drawn straight into the middle. And you can see that this is really heavy-handed intentionally, but as I take that exposure out, all of a sudden that wall just looks a bit drab as opposed to it grabbing everything being equally bright. You want the attention drawn into the center of the image. And again, if I go delete that, I can click this and then drag another one in and it copies the settings. Again, we can go back through, we get identical adjustments on both sides. Okay. Thanks, Francisco. Thanks for saying they're really good. I really enjoyed taking them. This was one of the more fun sessions I've shot lately, and honestly, I enjoy them all, but I had a whole day, so it felt like I had a lot of time to play. And that's kind of one of the advantages. Like when you book a longer engagement session, you don't necessarily get more pictures. What you do get is more time. And that means that we can try things that we wouldn't necessarily try in a shorter shoot because you don't feel like you're quite as pressed. You can spend a bit more time getting used to me being there. And if you look, like in this image, like I'm still trying to edit through, their faces are too dark. So when I'm looking at the shot, I'm trying to kind of see the focal point, and all I can focus on are the legs. Which is not a bad thing. Like, I mean, like they've got really nice legs, they're both of them. But there's another tool you can use here, which is like a localized selection. Now, this will decrease other areas of the image. And there's a way to turn this to your advantage, and there's a reason I'm not using a brush for this, because you can brush on these changes too. But if you look at this now, they are the brightest point in this image at this stage. And again, it's a heavy adjustment, so we're going to reduce the highlights again and the whites. And we're going to pop that back in. Now, when we close that, they are much brighter than the rest of the frame now. And the rest of the frame looks a bit duller. So you can now increase the exposure here. And they are apparently brighter than the rest of the image as a result. Now, I probably will still make this black and white. Because again, we're seeing a little bit of kind of motion blur, a little bit of haziness. And I feel like the romantic look you get from black and white is a little bit better for that. And then we're going to move on. Again, previous. Again, previous. Now this one I'm going to spend a bit more time on because I feel like when I was looking at this moment, this is what I was shooting for. Like I saw this and these were working towards getting the composition I wanted, and I was trying to use the leading lines from the kind of dock at the bottom, and that wasn't what I wanted. And then we get this. Now, I wish I'd noticed this guy being up here. I totally did not. So as much as his guitar playing is really cool, I don't want him in the image. This is when I kind of move to one of my other favorite things to do and use a cinematic aspect ratio. This is 2:1, which is like really, really wide. And you can see how instantly it draws attention into the couple in the middle because we've cropped out all the stuff around the edges. And yeah, it's really, really cool. And again, straightening the horizon because otherwise it'll do my head in. And then again, applying a color preset that I feel will add the right amount of contrast. That's the pushed portrait, which may be just right. It might be too much. I kind of think it's just right. I like that amount of contrast here. Yeah, perfect. So that and all soft was exactly what I was looking for. And you can see the rain falling. Like it's just, the shutter speeds are just slow enough. So they're just fast enough to stop that rain as it comes down. And in this shot, the light on her face is pretty much perfect. So there's no need for any of those local adjustments we looked at earlier. Yeah, so that's the shot I was looking for. When I saw this, what I wanted was that. And that's still a great shot. I'd still deliver that. That's what I wanted. Again, we get a couple more shots in the same vein. I must have seen the guy up there after saying that I hadn't seen him on the previous shot, because again, I've cropped it so that you can't see him. Again, back to that cinematic aspect, bring it back up, cropping in quite heavily here, but that's still the better shot. And again, you kind of, when you take a few of these at a time, it's a case of needing to edit yourself when you come back, and I feel like that is still the better shot out of the lot. Right. Yeah, and this is another moment. So again, this is an example of me shooting for a particular shot. I really like all of the shots in this little series, but you'll see when we get to it that there's a particular look that was clearly what was meant here, and that's what I want to get to. So again, start with the color. I'm pretty sure I'm going to prefer this in black and white, but we'll start with the color. My normal Portrait 400. And you can instantly see all the bright areas are now way too bright. So again, we go to the tone controls and bring it down to highlight soft. And can you see how that brought back the whites? Now I want you to watch what's happening over on the right hand side here. So it goes from having like a moderate highlight reduction and white reduction to having a much higher highlight reduction and a much higher white reduction. So you end up with more of those details being brought back. It does make the image look a bit darker, but in this situation, that's exactly what we wanted. It was too bright. And it's a bit cold as well, so we're going to warm the image up a bit. And if I was going to leave this in color, that's how I'd leave it. If we're going to go black and white, again, trying to keep it consistent, Delta 3200 medium format, and we're left with the same issue. The whites are still gone. So I could either manually adjust the highlights and whites down, or I can go to the preset, which I know I already like, highlight soft, and you can see it bring it down. Now in this case, on this preset, it also brought the blacks down slightly. You can go all soft, which will bring the blacks up, and then we'll make a global reduction to the exposure. And you end up with a bit more of a balanced image. So I was wrong. The color is nicer. So we can reset, Portrait 400, just the exposure, highlight soft to bring down the bits that are now a bit bright, and then bring it back up so that the whites are just on the cusp, and then warm it up again. Again, as I said before, if you're ever in doubt and you're nearly at it, daylight, and that'll get you a consistent white balance between shots. This is kind of what I was looking for. It's getting closer. And again, I mentioned before that I tend to like things cropped. I'd crop it like that. And I also don't like lens corrections on. But in this case, it might work. I'm seeing some distortion around his head. And actually applying it doesn't really fix it, so we'll leave that off. And again, I think I might feel this in black and white. Yeah, perfect. I actually quite like that some of these highlights are kind of blown out. Kind of makes it look a little bit more authentic. Thanks, Ines, that's really kind. And yeah, again, more emotion, but by this point, I think we've realized that this series is meant to be in black and white. Look at that. That's like, that's what I'm shooting for. So you have the kind of stillness and kind of gentleness of that, but you've got the emotion in it as well. And that's kind of what I really like to see in a shot. I like to see people interacting and enjoying it. Now, the reason I've stuck with this is because I feel like this really does look like medium format film, so I want to stick with a crop that would be appropriate for it. But even though this is horizontal, and normally I like to keep my horizontals wide, like very wide, I feel like this works better like this. And it also gives me some more control, because if you look, right now, he is the subject. But if you bring the shot over to this side, they are the subject. And if you have them central, you have the same story. So it's just amazing how much difference having a crop in an image can make. I probably prefer this shot because we've already got a couple that are a bit more about him. Sorry if my Lightroom lags a little bit. It's not used to running the streaming software at the same time as editing. Again, we're really happy with these kind of nice moments, and that seems like a really quiet, pleasant moment between them both. Yeah, I'm a fan. And again, you can see the black and white did a lot to kind of remove the appearance of blemishes on the skin. Again, it's really kind to kind of other people's appearances, which is good. Yeah, and again, the kind of crazy thing is, I'm looking at some of these shots now, and I'm editing them differently to the way I did the first time, because this is a shoot I've already delivered. I felt like it was fairer to kind of go through a shoot that I've already culled and people are already happy with, rather than kind of showing you something that's in progress. Although I'll definitely do that in future, but I'll do it with consent. But I didn't edit these in black and white. Like when I delivered them the first time, they were delivered in color because I preferred them then in color, whereas now I'm really liking the black and white. And that happens a lot. Like I'll find that going through this process of editing like makes me appreciate different things about an image. Yeah, it's cool. This was definitely going to be a black and white shot. It was photographed with the intention of being black and white. And actually, I think I actually photographed it with the idea of it being quite a wide shot as well. So we're going to make it, again, 2:1, a really cinematic aspect ratio. And it kind of looks like a still from the film. That's a good point, Milton. Like, I did lose some of the details. If you go back to that shot, I did lose some of the hair. But I feel like it's kind of, that's okay. Like it just to kind of illustrate the point, if I bring the highlights back, you get a bit of the hair back, but it takes some of the detail out of other areas. And I feel like it's nicer as this bright, kind of like nearly too bright image, because I feel like it looks more like it should have done, more like film should look. And again, shot for a cinematic aspect. Now, the success of this is different depending on how we deal with it. Now, this is probably a situation where I would use highlight soft. So here, not only is the hair losing some detail, but a lot of the background is gone. So again, highlight soft. It doesn't really bring everything back, but it brings enough back that you're seeing the contrast in the image again. And again, just that nice and a classic cinematic feel. Kind of a funny one. Probably should have been an outtake, but I don't know. I like to include these as well because I feel like it shows people being people. Again, this is probably going to be color, although I might keep it black and white to keep it consistent. But if we went to color, we're seeing this really strange green cast. Can you see it in the skin? So I'd need to remove that if I was going to keep it. And I've got a feeling that changing her skin tone is going to make his look too pink. This is happening because basically it was really cold. So his skin was actually pink. His nose was pink. This is probably the correct white balance for this shot. But he was freezing. And I don't want him to feel like that when he looks back at the image. So I'm going to reset this. We're going to keep the green that's there if we're going to do anything with it in color. And I'm going to vote black and white. Because all of a sudden you can't tell that he was cold. All you're seeing is this really nice, quiet moment, and it's taken away that distraction. And again, it feels like quite a classic kind of mood. So I'd probably bring up the crop like that and keep that aspect again. I'll bring it in a little bit more to kind of avoid some of the distortion. That'll do nicely. Then crop. So Kate always assists me on shoots. That's my wife. She was holding an umbrella over them because it was still really raining. I mean, you can see the kind of like out of focus rain hitting the kind of the water. So in this situation, it's another advantage with kind of that kind of crop being an option, because we've kind of established that we do these kind of narrower, tighter crops in these shots. I can use that to kind of take that hand out of the image without having to clone it out and Photoshop it, because again, I don't like doing that. Yes, it's really, really cool. So I'm just going to take a minute to look at the chat because I feel like I've not looked at it for a while. So let's have a look. So we got somebody in the chat saying that they did a shoot with another photographer in the States, and and she licked his head, and it's kind of one of the best things that she liked, because the photographer included that, even though it didn't necessarily fit with the rest of the shots. It was one of her favorites, and I think that's a really good point. Like, it's really interesting to see that when you get somebody capture a moment, because again, like, look at this shot compared to the outtake. This is really, really, really great. Yeah, it's really great. And again, continuing through now here, you can still tell that his nose is cold, but the overall color looks quite a lot better. Quite a lot better. Back to the color presets, and now it's looking a little bit green again. As soon as I apply it, you can see that green come back into the shot. Again, we're warming that up a little, so you're adding the magenta back to that, and we are going to warm this up as well. I feel like maybe daylight would be a better starting point. I like that. And I want a bit more contrast in this. There we go. I feel like the highlights on this side of the image are a bit distracting. So again, gradient, drag it in to see where it's affecting. We're going to pull it into around about here, so the majority of the gradient's affecting the back of the head. And then we are going to get rid of the exposure adjustment and just bring it down as a highlight reduction and a white reduction. I feel like it lost a bit of contrast, so I'm going to put a little bit of that back in to make it look less obvious, and then click OK. Now that the gradient's off, I feel like it's affecting her face a little bit as well, so we're actually going to use a brush tool this time. And we're going to add, again, a little bit of exposure first, and we're going to turn auto mask on. This will mean that when you paint it in, it's going to try and avoid it in the background. So if we now do this, you can see how it's bringing some of that detail back out in her face. At the moment, again, it's really heavy-handed because we're using exposure, and exposure brings everything up, like all the midtones come right up. But instead, we're going to put that back. We're going to boost the whites, and we're going to raise the shadows. And you can see how raising those shadows kind of has a similar effect, but it's not quite as obvious. Maybe it's going to need a bit of both. Yeah, I kind of like it there. And just to make sure this is not affecting the background as well, hit the opposite, use the eraser, but keep the auto mask on. So again, I'm just feathering over the edge super mildly. I'm going to get rid of some of the unwanted brush strokes. That's that. Again, it's kind of added in kind of extra pop to her face. You can see a bit more of what she's looking at. Right. Now this is the issue with local adjustments, and one of the reasons why I try to avoid them. If you look at this, that doesn't quite look right in this shot, because this is affecting similar part of the image, but it's not quite the same. You can see a nose in a different place. Again, we're going to delete that. And we're going to work on the overall image first. Again, we've applied the previous preset. Too bright now. It's pretty good. And again, we've got one in color. We could get away with one in black and white, I think. And again, really classic looking shot. Now, this is a pretty enormous shoot. There's a bunch of stuff in here, and I kind of want to give you guys the option as to what we do next. There's some really cool shots coming up in this series. Then we move to a slightly different area. So once we've done a few more shots in this section, we're going to move here, and then I'm probably going to call it a day, because I feel like we've been at this quite a while. And this is probably a good breaking point. At this stage, it is 8 o'clock, and we start at 7, so we've been going for at least an hour, which is pretty good. So let's have a look. Now again, like I mentioned before about shots being out of focus, and sometimes that being on purpose, add a vibe and a feel. When we make this black and white, again, it has that nice classic vibe to it. Adding in the highlight soft kind of brings down those highlights, makes it a little bit darker, and again, to me, adds that classic vibe, adding some of the contrast back. and I am really a fan of that. This shot needs to be in color to me. I feel like it's got something about it. I also feel like it needs to be a bit brighter. And warmer. Much better. This central area is kind of distracting, and I think it's because there's a difference in brightness. So sometimes your eye can be drawn to a point that's not the subject if the brightness isn't right in that area. So right here, this is where I'm looking. So what I'm going to do is remove the enable lens corrections rather, to get rid of the vignettes around the edge, and then I'm going to bring this down until the skin tones are where I want them, and then I'm going to drag in vignettes to bring down the exposure in other areas. So rather than relying on the natural vignette from the lens, we're kind of creating our own vignette, and it's nowhere near as powerful. We're using just a very minor adjustment on the exposure, and we're adding these in gradually so we can create our own kind of unnatural vignette for the image and draw your attention into where we want it, which is right on them. They are beautiful people, not just in appearance. Right, and that's pretty good to me. Again, I'm still seeing some green, but to add context, they're stood under a tree to try and avoid the rain. So again, I could try and fight with this and take it out, and if I was doing a final edit, I probably would. I'd use a brush and I'd kind of apply a bit of magenta to counteract some of this color cast. But as we're just doing this for illustrative purposes, we're going to leave it because it's the kind of thing I wanted to spend time over. You can tell that it's the tree that's causing the issue because if you look at her legs, they are beautifully colored right now. So we know that the white balance is right. It's just that there's actually a color cast from all the green that was in the scene around them. And again, we can use similar kind of presets. I'm just going to quickly check these. They're still right in the middle of those gradients. So again, we should be fine with that. And there's a slight position change here, but even still, if we hit previous, we're going to reposition those gradients this time to make sure that we're kind of bringing the focus down into the right kind of area of the image. And I think we're pretty much there, but I want to be absolutely certain that we've got it right. Perfect. And again, we've brought that same focus. This is still a bit distracting, this kind of clump of greenery around here. So I'm going to go back to brushes, and I'm going to brush in around this area. Again, auto mask is still on, so it's going to try and avoid their faces. And we're going to bring that down a little bit more. And we're definitely going to bring the highlights down because, again, it's just too distracting. And to make it look less unnatural, I'm going to try and run this around this whole area. Now, the reason I turned auto mask off is because you can probably see that it was seeing these like contrast changes in the greenery in the background and trying not to apply the brush to that. And actually, we did want the brush to apply that to make it look more natural. So I turned it off again. Okay. Now, this is definitely a different kind of vibe. So you can see I adjusted the exposure here, got down at a different angle. The reason I wanted this was because I wanted to go for black and white again. Again, black and white, and it adds this kind of almost silhouette look. Now, actually, the background isn't that interesting. So if we raise this, you can see that there's this beautiful kind of contrast here. And again, we have this strange situation where that vignette's bringing our attention too far into the center of the frame. If we enable profile corrections to take that away and bring the exposure back down to just get the skin tones where we want them and the kind of shadows and darks on them where we want them, we can use gradients to bring back the rest of the image. Again, bring the gradient over, bring it over there, and bring down the exposure. And again, you can see how much better that's looking, how much less it's kind of affecting the overall balance of the image. Look. Again, there we go. So again, rather than having this, put that. Perfect. And again, they've not moved, so you can do exactly the same thing. And again, like a nice moment. Now, the same presets are clearly too bright, so let's go back there. Again, just the point where the skin's nearly white, but not quite. Okay, so then we get to a different situation. Again, start with the colors the way I want them. Contrast 8. There we go. And again, we're in a situation where we really need to kind of get the white balance right. So we're looking at the skin tones again. We're going to move to daylight. And we're going to move this over a little further, because now the only parts of the image we can see are the bits that are being affected by the green above. And bring these back. And then, as you probably noticed, like the overall brightness of the image really helps bring the skin tones out. Like her skin is kind of bronzer than his. Obviously, she probably tans. But yeah, we kind of end up in a situation we've got this nice set of colors. Now here, there is information being lost, like right at the top of the image here, and probably over here slightly. So we could bring that back by bringing back the highlights. But I actually think that's kind of part of the look. I think it's kind of important that things look like they're kind of nearly too bright. I think it kind of looks kind of like dreamy when we bring up the brightness overall. I might actually bring it up a bit further. Yeah, I think that's good. And again, lighting situations don't really change, so the majority of the kind of edits that we just made will still work, although they'll need slight tweaks. Now this image is something that I'd probably spend a bit longer on, because I feel like there's something about the way that her eyes are here. I'll just check to see if there's another image in this series that I like better. But that looks great. And I'm going to show you what I'm going to do to these images. So again, using the gradient tool, we're going to bring down the highlights and exposures at the back. You can see all of a sudden that these eyes are going to really stand out in this image. Bring back the highlights. Lights. The same on this side. Now on this side, we don't need the exposure adjustment because we don't need to bring down any blacks. We just want to have more attention on our eyes. Again, give it that round to about there. And there's kind of a little bit of an effect on the collar, so we can fix that using the auto mask and a highlights and whites brush. Bring back contrast in the shirt. Again, I'm just going to erase out this area because we went a bit too. Yeah. Right. And then again, you can pretty much copy paste. Now, on this shot, I'm going to have to mess with the gradient a little bit, because if you look at it, it's kind of putting at the wrong angle. It looks a bit less natural. Again, the exposure adjustment can come back a bit. This is all pretty slow. Now, the reason I'm kind of taking time over this is that in an actual edit, I would definitely spend longer than this on an image like this, because I feel like all of the information that I want people to be looking at is right in the center of the image. So after I've done this edit on the whole shot, I'd then crop it into like a more cinematic aspect. It kind of takes away some of this dead space at the bottom and the top of the frames. So you're just looking right in the center of the image. Bam. So I'm just going to take a minute to look at the chat, see what we're up to, because I've not looked at it for a while. Ah, thanks, Ines. That's really kind of you. I'm glad you're enjoying it, and thanks everybody for coming out and watching, like family or otherwise. It's all it's all appreciated. I started this live stream with 0 people like subscribe to me and like no views on my channels. This is all literally brand new. So thanks again for supporting me. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a challenge. So Javon was saying that it's difficult to kind of match skin tones when people have got 2 different skin colors. I mean, as skin tones go, these are pretty similar. These are not that challenging, but it can definitely be a challenge when you've got, say, somebody who's very pale, or somebody that's got like African parents or is African, like that kind of thing, a really dark skin tone against a really light skin tone, or even like different kind of like oils in the skin, because sometimes it can get really reflective. Yeah, it's interesting. And again, similar to the previous shot, you apply the same edit, see how it looks. It looks pretty good. Now we can't really go back to the previous shot for the image colors, but again, like you can see here, this is where the attention needs to be. Again, just set the brightness so that I can see exactly the detail I want in the area that I want. And then I think this is going to be black and white. That then makes the rest of the image too bright, so you bring down the highlights. And again, it's probably still a little bit too bright. So again, profile corrections on, and then use the gradient tools to bring back in the detail. Kind of like that. And trying to be a bit more painstaking about it because I feel like it deserves it. But again, if I was doing a full edit, this would get a lot more time than I'm giving these. This is one of the reasons why it takes quite a while to deliver images, and why I think it's important to spend a good amount of time on every client, because otherwise you end up kind of losing some of the kind of finer details in images because you try and get things done too quickly. And it's definitely worthwhile giving people the level of attention that a wedding deserves and that kind of an engagement deserves, because it is like I mean, hopefully it's a once in a lifetime thing. It's not the kind of thing you want to do more than once. I don't think anybody goes into marriage wanting it to fail. And again, out of focus images look better in black and white. I probably wouldn't deliver that one, mainly because we've already got some that are already clearly the same mood, same moment, but they're just kind of better technical images, so I probably wouldn't deliver that one as well because it just seems a bit pointless. This again is an image that I'd take a long time to kind of edit because the focus is down here. And for the sake of this video, we're going to skip ahead a little bit because I want to kind of get to some of the other shots in Manchester before we stop. So there are kind of images using more architectural elements and kind of things that are a bit more unique to the area. But what I really wanted to get to was this series of shots. Now, when I went into the shoot, I knew that these guys like to dress up, like dress up. They like to be suited up and they like to wear dresses. So I had in my head that it was going to be bad weather because I'd checked the weather forecast before going out, and I knew that this was going to be kind of a nice thing to do. So I had him take his jacket off and give it to her because I saw in my head that it was going to look like this. And when you're taking the shot, you expose for the highlights, so you can see just the edges of where the light's hitting them. And you stand in a place where there's no light coming from the angle that the camera's shooting from. And you end up with this kind of like black, shadowy area as they're closer to you, and then just the edges picked out by the light behind them. And again, this doesn't need much editing because I heavily pre-visualized it and worked to find a place where the image would work. You get little things like this where they're grasping, like trying to hold each other closer. And to me, the emotion in this shot is here and here, like in the hair, not in the kiss. To the point where I actually focused more heavily on the hand in the next shot. Ironically, I like that shot better, but you see what I was shooting for. Now, there's kind of a trick to this, because if you look at this, every one of these shots has got a different amount of light hitting their face. You have to kind of time things so that they're in a position where you can see light that's highlighting the edges of both of their faces. Otherwise, you can't really see enough for it to look natural. So I had him do this again, mainly because the first time around he literally just put it on his shoulders, and I feel like a big part of the kind of mood here is him being a gentleman and giving up his jacket. He went back round and had him like slowly give the jacket, and then you get moments like this, which is probably a nothing moment, but I really like it because of the way he's looking at her. Her hair's moving, her hands moving. It just seems like a really dynamic image. And then you get this, and she just looks intense. And again, that's that highlight on the edges. You can see where all the details coming from, and again, all the lights from above and behind them. Okay, this is a different kind of feel, and we're going to end after these images in this little area. This is down on the kind of like canal side in Manchester, and it's only here like for a little bit of a year. This is just a bar basically. There's no palm trees in Manchester. It's not that warm, but this was just there for this kind of like brief period, and we're going to try and warm this up to make it look a little bit less cold and dreary. I'm just changing the white balance to cloudy because I want to add some more golden light into the skin. And I'm going to increase the exposure. And if you look at that and compare it to that, that's how powerful editing is. And when you take the shot, you need to be able to know that you can do that. You need to be able to, in your head, visualize that it's not going to look like this when you've finished it. It's going to look like that. And then you're shooting for a moment. To be honest, the main reason I kept that in is because of how amazing his hair is. I had a major hair jealousy. It's just not fair. But people should not look as pretty as these two people look. And I think this is a good spot to end it, guys. So I guess I'm going to kind of throw it open to you for a minute. Like, if anybody's got any questions, feel free to ask them. Obviously, we covered quite a lot, but if not, we're going to probably say goodbye and kind of, I guess, let you get on with your Friday evenings. Probably doing something a little bit more exciting than watching a photographer edit on a Friday night. But yeah, does anybody have any questions? While you're kind of taking your time to type, if you're going to type, I'm just going to let you know that you can find my work at www.bytomw.com. So it's bytomw.com. There's a lot of stuff on there. There's kind of a separate blog for photographers, but the majority stuff on the main page is couples, and then just kind of like kind of shoots like that. And yeah, Javen's correctly identified we're ending in Bagel Nash, which is absolutely right. It's on the front near the canal in Manchester. And yeah. So it's been a pleasure, guys. Thank you very much for listening to me live stream. I will probably do this again, but on a shoot that I haven't prepared when I'm just editing in general. So if you ever feel like kind of seeing if I'm streaming, feel free, stay subscribed, and I'll be back. Thanks very much, guys. See you all later.